The child shouldn't have been able to walk, not with those wounds, not after 3 days alone in the wilderness. But there he was, standing in the center of their settlement at dawn, clutching something that made the elder's face go white. "Where did you find this?" Gideon Nash whispered, staring at the object in the boy's tiny fist. The other community members gathered closer, their expressions shifting from concern to something that looked like fear. The 4-year-old opened his mouth to speak, but only a soft humming sound came out. It was a melody that made every adult step back. Clara Bell recognized it immediately, and her hand flew to her throat. "That's impossible," she breathed. "Children don't know that song. No one's sung it for 20 years. The boy tilted his head, studying their faces with eyes that seemed far too aware for his small body. When he smiled, something cold settled in every person's stomach, because according to everything they believed about their isolated settlement, about the careful distance they maintained from the outside world, this child should not have found them. Yet here he was, and the thing he held in his hand was something Clara Bell had hoped never to see again. A simple wooden carving, no bigger than a child's thumb, but she knew what it meant. She knew who had made it, and why it had been hidden away with such desperate secrecy. Gideon Nash knelt down slowly, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward the boy. "Son, who gave this to you?" The child's humming stopped abruptly. He looked directly into the elder's eyes and spoke his first clear words since arriving. "The lady with the sad face. She said to bring it home." Clara Bell's legs nearly gave out. She gripped Eli Thompson's arm so hard her knuckles went white. "Gideon," she whispered, "that's not possible. She's been dead for 6 years." The elder's face had gone ashen. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the wooden carving. Around them, more community members had gathered, forming a protective circle around the mysterious child. But Gideon Nash was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about the message that had arrived just yesterday, warning them that dangerous men were coming. Men who asked questions about missing children and forgotten songs. "Clara," he said quietly, "take the boy to the barn. Keep him safe, and keep him quiet." His voice carried an authority that made everyone listen. "Eli, gather every able man and woman in the settlement. Tell them to bring whatever weapons they have." The child looked up at him with those 2 knowing eyes. "They're already coming, aren't they?" he asked in his small voice. Gideon Nash felt a chill run down his spine as he heard the distant sound of horses approaching. Too many horses. Far too many for a friendly visit. He lifted the boy into his arms, feeling how light and fragile the child was despite his remarkable journey. "Yes, son," he said softly, "but they're not taking you anywhere. You're one of us now." As the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, Clara Bell realized with growing dread that everything they had built here, everything they had sacrificed to create, was about to be tested in ways they had never imagined. The riders appeared on the horizon like a dark storm cloud, dust billowing behind them in the morning light. Clara Bell pressed the boy closer to her chest as they hurried toward the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind them, she could hear Gideon Nash shouting orders, his voice carrying across the settlement with urgent authority. 20 men, maybe more," Eli Thompson called out, lowering his spyglass. "Armed and riding hard. They know exactly where they're going." The child in Clara's arms had gone completely still, his small body tense with a fear that seemed beyond his years. "They hurt the lady with the sad face," he whispered against her shoulder. "They made her cry before she stopped breathing." Clara's blood ran cold. The lady he spoke of could only be one person, and if she was truly dead, then these men had committed murder to get information about this settlement. She pushed open the barn door and set the boy down gently on a pile of hay, then knelt before him. "Listen to me," she said, gripping his small shoulders. "You must stay hidden no matter what happens. No matter what you hear outside, you do not come out until I tell you it's safe." The boy nodded solemnly, but his eyes held questions that Clara couldn't answer. Questions about why these men wanted him so desperately, and why a simple wooden carving could strike such terror into the hearts of adults. Outside, the thundering hoofbeats had stopped. Clara peered through a gap in the barn wall and saw them, a line of hard-faced men mounted on sweating horses. Their leader, a tall man with pale eyes and a scar running from his ear to his jaw, dismounted slowly and approached Gideon Nash. "We're looking for something that belongs to us," the scarred man said, his voice carrying clearly across the settlement. "A boy, about 4 years old. We have reason to believe he wandered into your little community." Gideon Nash stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Around him, nearly 50 members of their community had gathered, men and women alike, each one carrying some form of weapon. Old hunting rifles, farming tools, even kitchen knives. They looked determined but vastly outnumbered. "We don't have any missing children here," Gideon replied evenly. "Perhaps you should look elsewhere." The scarred man smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I think you misunderstand. The boy isn't missing. He's stolen property, and we have legal papers that say he belongs to us." Clara felt sick to her stomach. Legal papers. That could only mean one thing in a territory where laws were often twisted to serve those with money and influence. The child behind her was not just lost or orphaned. He was someone's property, bought and paid for, and these men had come to collect their investment. "Now," the scarred man continued, pulling a folded document from his coat, "you can make this easy and hand him over, or we can make it very difficult for everyone involved." That's when Clara heard it. The sound of more horses approaching from every direction, surrounding their settlement like a noose tightening around their necks. The sound grew louder, and Clara's worst fears were confirmed. Through the barn wall, she watched in horror as more riders emerged from behind the hills, from the tree line. From every direction their settlement could be approached. Not 20 men, not 50. She counted at least 100, maybe more, all armed and positioned with military precision. "Dear God," she whispered, pulling the boy deeper into the shadows. "Who are you, child? What makes you worth an army?" The boy looked up at her with those unsettling eyes. "They call me Thomas, but that's not my real name. The lady with the sad face, she told me my real name before they hurt her. She said I had to remember it no matter what." "What is your real name?" Clara asked, though part of her was afraid to know. "She said I'm William Morrison. She said my father was a very important man before he died. She said that's why they want me so bad." Clara's blood turned to ice. Morrison. She knew that name. Every person in their settlement knew that name. William Morrison had been the territorial judge who had exposed a massive corruption scheme involving land sales and human trafficking. He had been murdered 2 years ago, along with his entire family, or so everyone believed. Outside, the scarred man was still talking, but his tone had changed. "We know you people have a reputation for taking in strays and runaways. Noble, really. But this particular stray is worth $50,000 to the right people. That's more money than your entire settlement will see in 10 years. $50,000. Clara felt sick. That kind of money meant the boy wasn't just property. He was leverage. Someone powerful wanted him alive, which meant someone else equally powerful wanted him dead. And their small community had just found itself caught in the middle of a war they never knew existed. Gideon Nash's voice carried clearly across the settlement. "I don't care if he's worth $1 million. We don't sell children here." The scarred man laughed, but it was a cold sound. "You misunderstand again. Old man, we're not here to buy anything. We're here to collect what's already ours. The boy was legally purchased 3 years ago from a children's home in Denver. We have the papers to prove it." "Purchased from a children's home?" Eli Thompson stepped forward, his rifle raised. "Children aren't cattle to be bought and sold. Tell that to the courts," the scarred man replied. "Now we can do this the easy way, or we can burn your settlement to the ground and dig through the ashes. Your choice." Clara watched as more of their community members emerged from buildings, taking defensive positions behind anything that could provide cover. Women carrying hunting rifles, men with old military weapons, even teenagers with farming tools. She counted quickly and felt her heart sink. Maybe 60 able fighters against what looked like 200 armed men. But then she saw something that gave her hope. At the edge of the settlement, more figures were appearing. People from the neighboring farms and ranches, people who had gotten word somehow and come to help. The network of communication in this territory was better than any army could imagine. The boy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Clara, I remember something else the lady told me. She said if the bad men came, I should tell you about the cave behind the waterfall. She said you would know what that means." Clara's eyes widened. The cave behind the waterfall. She hadn't thought about that place in 20 years, but she knew exactly what the dying woman had meant. And if she was right, their community might have one chance to save this child and themselves. Clara's mind raced as she processed what the boy had told her. The cave behind the waterfall had been their community's last resort escape route, built in the early days when Indian raids were a real threat. But it had been sealed for decades, forgotten by most, known only to the original founders. For the dying woman to know about it meant she had been here before, Long ago. William, she said softly, testing the name. The lady who told you this, did she say her name was Rebecca Morrison? The boy nodded immediately. She said she was my mama, but I should call her Rebecca so the bad men wouldn't know. She said she'd been looking for me for a very long time. Clara's throat tightened. Rebecca Morrison had been Judge Morrison's wife, reportedly killed with the rest of the family. But Clara remembered her now. Remembered a young woman who had visited their settlement years ago, asking questions about children who needed safe homes. Rebecca had been part of an underground network that helped families escape dangerous situations. Outside, the tension was escalating. The scarred man had grown tired of negotiations. You have exactly 10 minutes to produce the boy, or we start burning buildings, starting with the schoolhouse. Clara peered through the barn wall and saw that their reinforcements had indeed arrived. Men and women from 6 different settlements, maybe 150 people total, all taking defensive positions. But they were still outnumbered, and the enemy had better weapons and military training. She turned back to William, kneeling down to meet his eyes. Listen carefully, I'm going to take you to a safe place, but we have to move very quietly. Can you do that? The boy nodded solemnly. Rebecca taught me how to be quiet. She said my life might depend on it someday. Clara felt a surge of respect for the dead woman. Rebecca Morrison had died protecting her son, but she had prepared him well. She gathered some supplies from the barn, including rope and a lantern, then took William's small hand in hers. They slipped out the back of the barn, moving from building to building, staying in the shadows. Clara could hear Gideon Nash still trying to buy them time, his voice carrying across the settlement as he argued with the scarred man. But she could also hear the sound of weapons being loaded, of horses moving into attack positions. The waterfall was a quarter-mile behind the settlement, hidden in a grove of trees that provided perfect cover. Clara had made this journey as a child, playing games and exploring, never imagining she would one day use it to save a life. As they reached the tree line, William suddenly stopped and tugged on her hand. Miss Clara, there's something else. Rebecca gave me something before she died. She said to only give it to someone I trusted completely. He reached into his small shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and stained but still intact. Clara opened it carefully and felt her heart stop. It was a map, but not just any map. It showed the locations of 12 different safe houses, each one marked with symbols that indicated how many people they could hide, and for how long. But more importantly, it showed the location of a federal marshal's station, only 2 days' ride from their settlement. A station that specialized in protecting witnesses and pursuing corruption cases. Rebecca Morrison hadn't just been trying to save her son. She had been trying to expose the entire network of people who bought and sold children like livestock. A gunshot echoed across the settlement, followed by shouting. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized their time had run out. The scarred man had made good on his threat, and the battle for William Morrison's life was about to begin. More gunshots erupted behind them as Clara and William reached the waterfall. The sound of the rushing water would mask their movements, but it also meant they couldn't hear how close their pursuers might be. Clara's hands shook as she moved aside the heavy rocks that concealed the cave entrance, rocks that hadn't been disturbed in 20 years. "Hurry, William," she whispered, pushing him through the narrow opening. The cave was larger than she remembered, stretching back into the hillside with multiple passages branching off into darkness. Her lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls as they moved deeper underground. William suddenly stopped and pointed to marks carved into the stone wall. "Miss Clara, look. Rebecca showed me how to read these. She said they were important." Clara raised the lantern higher and gasped. The marks weren't random scratches. They were dates and initials, dozens of them, carved by people who had hidden in this cave over the years. But the most recent entries made her blood run cold. Names and dates from the past 3 years, including one that made her heart race with recognition. RM and WM, March 1871. Safe. Federal Marshal contacted. Evidence hidden. Rebecca Morrison had been here before, with William, and she had been in contact with federal authorities. The wooden carving wasn't just a keepsake, it was a key, literally carved with tiny symbols that matched markings on the cave wall. Clara studied it closely and realized what Rebecca had done. She had created a code system, using the cave as a message center for the underground network. Behind them, the sounds of battle were growing louder. Clara could hear men shouting, the crack of rifle fire and something that made her stomach drop, the thunder of many horses moving fast, coming their way. They found our trail, she said, fighting back panic. William, we need to go deeper into the cave. There are other passages that lead to different exits. But as they moved further underground, William pulled out something else from his shirt. Another piece of paper, smaller than the map, wrapped in oiled cloth. Rebecca said this was the most important thing. She said it would stop the bad men forever if it got to the right person. Clara unfolded the paper and felt her world shift. It wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was a complete list of names, dates, and financial transactions. Judges who had been bought, officials who had sold children to wealthy families who wanted servants, or worse. A network that stretched across 3 territories and involved some of the most powerful men in the region. At the bottom of the list was a signature that made Clara's hands tremble. The territorial governor himself had signed off on the sale of dozens of children, including William Morrison. The boy wasn't just evidence of crime. He was evidence of treason, of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Above them, she could hear voices echoing down into the cave. Men with torches, calling out, searching. The scarred man's voice was among them, closer than she had feared possible. "Find the boy," he was shouting. "He's worth more than money now. He's worth our lives if we don't bring him back." Clara grabbed William's hand and ran deeper into the cave, toward passages she hoped she remembered correctly. Because if they were caught now, it wouldn't just mean William's death. It would mean the deaths of everyone in their settlement, and the continued enslavement of countless other children across the territory. The deeper passages of the cave were treacherous, filled with loose rocks and sudden drops that could break an ankle or worse. Clara moved as quickly as she dared, William's small hand gripping hers tightly as they navigated by the flickering light of her lantern. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers echoed off the stone walls, sometimes seeming close enough to touch, other times fading into the distance. "Miss Clara," William whispered. "Rebecca told me something else. She said if we ever got trapped in a cave to look for the passage that goes up, not down. She said it would lead to the old mine shaft." Clara's heart leaped. The old mine shaft. She had forgotten about it. But William was right. There was an abandoned silver mine that connected to this cave system, with an exit nearly 2 miles away. If they could reach it, they would be far enough from the settlement to send for help. They took the next passage that angled upward, climbing over fallen rocks and squeezing through narrow openings that would be difficult for grown men to follow. The air grew fresher as they climbed, and Clara dared to hope they might escape. But their hope was shattered by the sound of an explosion from above. Not gunfire. Something much larger. The entire cave shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Clara realized with growing horror what was happening. The scarred man wasn't just trying to capture William. He was trying to bury them alive, to eliminate all evidence of what the boy knew. "They're blasting the cave entrances," she said, fighting to keep the panic out of her voice. "They're sealing us in." William looked up at her with those unnaturally mature eyes. Rebecca said that might happen. She said the bad men would rather kill everyone than let the truth come out. That's why she made the map with all the safe houses. She knew someday someone would have to finish what she started. Another explosion, closer this time, sent rocks tumbling around them. Clara realized they had no choice but to press forward, even if it meant walking into a trap. Behind them, the passage was probably already sealed. Their only chance was to reach the mine shaft before the entire cave system collapsed. As they climbed higher, William suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Look, Miss Clara, light." She looked where he was pointing and saw it. Natural light filtering down from above, growing stronger as they approached. They were almost to the mine shaft exit. But as they got closer, Clara heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices. Men's voices waiting at the top of the shaft. The scarred man had anticipated their escape route and positioned his men accordingly. They were trapped between the collapsing cave behind them and armed killers above them. "What do we do now?" William asked, his small voice echoing in the narrow passage. Clara looked at the evidence still clutched in her hand, then at the boy whose life represented the only chance of exposing the greatest corruption scandal in territorial history. She made the hardest decision of her life. "We fight," she said quietly, "because some things are worth dying for, and you're one of them." Clara pressed herself against the mine shaft wall, pulling William close as she heard the men above positioning themselves for an ambush. She had one advantage they didn't know about. The old mine had multiple shafts, and she remembered there was a second exit, about 50 yards to the east, hidden behind a collapsed section that looked impassable. but wasn't. "Can you climb?" she whispered to William, pointing to a series of metal rungs that led sideways along the shaft wall toward the hidden passage. The boy nodded without hesitation. Rebecca had trained him well. They began moving slowly along the wall, Clara testing each rung carefully before putting her full weight on it. The metal was old and rusty, but it held. Above them, she could hear the scarred man giving orders to his men. "He's got to come up eventually. When he does, we take him alive. The boss wants to question him personally before we dispose of the evidence." Clara's blood chilled at those words, but they also gave her crucial information. There was someone above the scarred man, someone powerful enough to order the deaths of an entire settlement to protect their secrets. The territorial governor was just part of a larger conspiracy. They reached the collapsed section of the mine, and Clara quickly moved aside the carefully arranged rocks that concealed the passage. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it led to freedom. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, William suddenly stopped. "Miss Clara, listen," he whispered. She heard it too, the sound of many horses approaching fast. But these weren't the scarred man's reinforcements. The hoofbeats had a different rhythm, more organized, more disciplined, military. They emerged from the hidden exit, just as a column of blue-uniformed cavalry crested the hill, led by a man wearing a federal marshal's badge. Clara's heart soared as she recognized the lead rider, Marshal James Crawford, the same man whose station was marked on Rebecca Morrison's map. "Marshal Crawford," she called out, standing up and waving the precious documents. "I have evidence of territorial corruption and child trafficking, evidence that Judge Morrison died trying to expose." The marshal rode hard toward them, his face grim with determination. Behind him, Clara counted at least 60 federal troops, armed and ready for battle. The scarred man and his hired killers were about to face the full force of federal justice. "Ma'am, get that boy to safety," Marshal Crawford shouted as he dismounted. "We received Rebecca Morrison's message 3 days ago, but we've been tracking this corruption ring for months. Today, it ends." Clara looked down at William, who was staring at the federal troops with something like hope in his young eyes. "Are we safe now?" he asked. Before she could answer, gunfire erupted from the mine shaft as the scarred man and his men realized they were surrounded. The final battle for William Morrison's life, and the truth his mother died protecting, was about to begin. The battle lasted less than an hour. The scarred man and his hired killers, caught between federal troops and the armed settlers, fought desperately, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. When the gunsmoke cleared, the scarred man lay dead near the mine entrance, clutching a telegram that revealed the name of his employer. The territorial governor had indeed ordered William's capture and the destruction of all evidence, but his message had been intercepted by federal agents who had been building their case for months. Marshal Crawford knelt beside Clara and William, his weathered face softening as he looked at the boy. "Son, your mother was one of the bravest women I ever knew. She risked everything to gather this evidence, and she died making sure you could finish what she started." William looked up at the marshal with those remarkable eyes. "Is it over now? Are the bad men all caught?" "The territorial governor is already in federal custody," Marshal Crawford replied. "Your mother's evidence exposed a network that sold over 200 children across 3 territories. Today, every one of those children will be freed, and every man who bought them will face justice." Clara felt tears running down her cheeks as she realized the full scope of what Rebecca Morrison had accomplished. One woman's determination to save her son had broken apart a criminal empire that had destroyed hundreds of families. At the settlement, Gideon Nash and the community members were receiving the news with mixture of relief and amazement. The elder walked slowly toward Clara and William, his face showing the strain of the morning's battle, but also something else. Pride. "Young William," he said, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes. "Your mother asked us to protect you, and we did. But you protected us too. Your courage helped expose evil that would have continued for years." William stepped forward and hugged the old man tightly. "Gideon, Rebecca told me that family isn't just blood. She said family is people who choose to love you. Will you choose to love me?" The elder's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. "Son, we already have. You're one of us now, and you always will be." 6 months later, William Morrison was legally adopted by Gideon Nash and Clara Bell, who had married in a ceremony attended by representatives from all the settlements that had helped save the boy's life. The wooden carving that had started it all was carved into a memorial stone for Rebecca Morrison, placed in the center of their settlement as a reminder that one person's courage can change the world. William grew up surrounded by love, protection, and the knowledge that his mother's sacrifice had freed hundreds of children and brought justice to those who had been forgotten by society. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the settlement held a celebration not of victory, but of the power of community to protect the innocent. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.